Thank you, Lena.
Thank you.
I thought maybe George, you start.
Well, I actually want to start.
I feel like I must have learned something last night, at least that.
I really want to start, and also thank you again, Lena, where you finished, and you and Josh, the issues that you and Josh brought forward about attention and inattention, and what it means to listen indiscriminately and yet intently, seemed to me worth revisiting at the end of the kind of festival that this has been on behalf of the audience, because you both did a really magnificent job talking about what the different forms of listening imply and make possible for your respective vocations. But I began to think about, what do we do who are not in those roles? And how does that opportunity and that prospective form of listening potentially inform our political roles and our sanity or lack thereof? Because I think ultimately, even though in this room at this minute, I hope people are listening as intently as possible, I really think as a broader society, as a more inclusive public, the kind of listening that we're called upon to do now is that same kind of unprejudiced, extremely expansive listening that you were both talking about. And I was rereading Benjamin's essay on the storyteller and remembering how much he focuses on the idea that the real crisis of the age that also has a political dimension is when we can no longer absorb our own experience. We don't know how to make it ours. We don't know how to make what happens to us stick and become incorporated in our sensibilities. And listening, and the art of listening specifically, is for him probably the key channel through which experience happens. It's not running out and seeing what that siren is all about. It's about being aware of the whole room with the siren there as well. And when he writes about what it is that endangers listening, he says specifically, well, it's the loss of the art of weaving and spinning.
And the storyteller is that wonderful image. I was promising myself not to talk until you finished, but
Please.
It just never can quite happen. But the storyteller is like the potter who puts his fingerprints on the story as the potter does on his clay.
Yeah, it's a beautiful image. I can't help bringing up, when you raise that, these group of artist scientists who are trying to work with spun pots, to almost like a record album, to see whether they could manage to hear the sounds that were in the space where the fingers were making the grooves on the pot when the clay was wet.
Just a slight digression, but why not, though?
What I wanted to think about and get you to respond to, though, is what it means to listen not with full attention as a strategy for opening ourselves to what may be the unexpected necessary thing to hear. I mean, Benjamin writes about how the apogee of physical relaxation is sleep, and the apogee, the zenith, the high point of psychological relaxation, he talks about being boredom. And he talks in a way that resonates with some of the things that in the Adam Phillips essay that came up yesterday. The ways that when we are partly lulled into almost a state of semi-somnambulance, a reverie, where we're doing something else, where the craft of our work is also part of the ways that we listen, maybe we are then going to be able to break through all the filters that we place on the world that assaults us as noise and actually be surprised by something. More even than that, he talks about how that kind of listening is how we make experience part of ourselves. It's in self-forgetfulness, he says, that a memory impresses itself upon us most deeply, and that with the absorption of a memory, that we actually have an experience, that we grow as human beings. And certainly it seems...
And I think he takes it further, and he says that will be the possibility of wisdom.
Truth is the epic side of wisdom, and it comes in that form, exactly. And certainly it seems to me now that we have, obviously, not only an incredibly reactive space of speech, where everything is just bouncing off and deflecting immediately, as though that absorption, that slower absorption associated with wisdom and experience, were somehow itself the enemy, the danger point, the risk. But within that reactive space, no one is really experiencing what's going on in a way that they can use.
Partly because of speed.
Partly because of this
speed.
imperative of speed.
I remember that wonderful line, it comes back to me as you're talking, that wonderful line where Benjamin is quoting Valéry, and he says that man no longer works at what cannot be abbreviated. Which is so powerful, right? And so powerful at this particular moment, when we think that partly absorption isn't possible because bombardment is constant.
Right. And almost as though if we fail to be responsive to the bombardment, there's an implication that it's a moral failure. Moral failure, even though it may be the only place in which morality can happen, is that stepping back. I mean, so many moments politically now are dictated by the need to respond immediately to a story that snowballs at these lightning speeds. So I was just interested in the ways that everything that Benjamin was talking about there seemed relevant to not so much maybe the professional relationship, where I don't know that you can afford to be bored or allow work to happen, to be knitting when you're doing one of your public curations of curiosity.
It might be something new for me to take up. Knitting on stage while talking. That's an idea whose time hasn't come.
I have to read this one moment. This one moment from where, after he's introduced the idea of relaxation as the key modality of listening.
I don't remember it.
Boredom is the dream bird that hatches the egg of experience. A rustling in the leaves drives him away, and the nest is lost. And I thought so often, when that question of what it is we're listening for, I thought, well, in a broad way, we're listening for some kind of siren call of home.
What does that mean? I've heard you use that term before. I'd love to know what that actually, I think, evokes for you.
So many people now feel displaced, either literally because of their fortunes as an individual in some kind of semi-stateless or entirely stateless capacity, but we also feel displaced from our experience. We feel displaced when we walk down the street because maybe we're listening to something over here, or we're displaced because of the noise of the different environments we exist in. We sense that there is some kind of a lodestone is not quite the right term. I like the idea of the siren call because there's a kind of winsome seduction. It isn't nostalgic, and this is sort of moving into a slightly different place with that idea. But you may remember also with Benjamin how he calls Benjamin's novel really a book about homesickness. But the more that I read that passage and thought about it, the more I came to think it's a home. He's sick for a home that he has never yet managed to dwell in. He's sick for a home that has been absorbed into himself and his childhood experience. He compares it to the stocking, the Christmas stocking, that the child sees these two different forms, where on the one hand this sock exists in a bag of language, and then it turns itself inside out and becomes this repository of sparkling gifts and wonder. And he says that Proust was really always trying to empty the dummy of himself. And so much of Benjamin's work, and I think I hope we'll get to this, but where I think he's trying to present a moral position that may have some relevance for us at a time of such cataclysmic freefall is how we can make our act of absorbing ourselves in the world become actually the deepest way of engaging with it and preserving our own integrity as human beings, as something more than just reactive robots, which is always where he and a lot of the thinkers that have been talked about in the course of this conference are trying to distance themselves from that possibility and find an alternative. Something that doesn't make you a creature of the algorithm is maybe the most immediately relevant expression of that phenomenon for our own time.
So how do you manage that balance?
Well, I don't think for Benjamin there was a balance, specifically for him.
Neither a balance nor a search for it?
Perhaps not. I mean, in an essay that I know you love as much as I do, Unpacking My Library, where he talks about it, what it means to be a collector. And so much of what Benjamin writes about is anti-possessive. But with books, he says, to be truthful, the kind of intimacy that a collector has with his works requires some kind of ownership.
He goes further, right? Possession is the deepest form of now I'm forgetting but it's the deepest form of relationship we have with the object we collect. I mean, it's again going back to what Samantha and I spoke about the first evening. There's a tactile relationship with the object. The object needs to be caressed. The object needs to be saved. And I think it's in that essay that he says that things are liberated from the drudgery of being useful.
Well, that's a key idea that I hope we'll bring up in different context. This really gets at the heart of his interest in language, is what it means for language not to be useful. But the end of that essay, critically, he says that it's not that these objects in our collection live through us, but that we live in them. And for that very reason, he says, I'm now vanishing into these building blocks that I've made of these books. So reading him in preparation for this and things that I'm writing now, the number of times in which the idea of self-vanishing becomes a liberation from not so much the guilty, hateful, neurotic that we might try to escape from, you and I, for different reasons, but a liberation from this.
But both of us. Yeah.
A liberation from a state of subjectivity which he views as politically impotent, artistically empty, and ultimately spiritually void. That it is, there's. Can I read one small other passage that I?
You actually do not ask for permission.
I was thinking a lot about what he wants curiosity to be, and how curiosity is a word that has come up, I think, repeatedly in the conversations over recent days, and it's difficult to, it's beguiling and it's wonderful, but it's sometimes difficult to know what it means in practice. And I think when Benjamin is writing about Proust, there's one particular passage where I think he's trying to conjure a model for himself as well. And he writes, Proust's most accurate, most convincing insights fasten on their objects as insects fasten on leaves, blossoms, branches, betraying nothing of their existence until a leap, a beating of wings, a volt shows the startled observer that some incalculable individual life has imperceptibly crept into an alien world. So he's calling almost for a form of metamorphic attention to the world. You can become the things that you concentrate on in the right way, in ways that both enlarge yourself, make yourself disappear, and maybe open a space for a kind of deep, unfathomably deep form of reflection that both protects you against the noise of the times and yet makes you absolutely engaged with creation in ways that become, I think, overwhelmingly vital when we feel most futile, as in this time. I think it was maybe Masha Gessen who said early on in the first Trump administration that one of the problems in moments such as these is that we no longer do the work of culture that is our work, that we become lost to that obligatory vocation of whatever it is we can contribute, these things whose value may not emerge immediately, that may only emerge in the ruins of the way society looks even today, let alone the way it looked.
The Sholem idea of shards of hope, just
from the Kabbalah.
Just bits and pieces.
Yeah. But these three thinkers that I wrote about, or writers, not really exclusively thinkers at all, Stefan Zweig, the novelist, and then Gershom Sholem, who was, for those who don't know, the first person who took the Kabbalah as an academic historical subject, took it sort of out of the yeshiva and out of the context of direct theological engagement and made it something you could zoom back from. And Benjamin in a way /Freud/Heine, they each have different ways of experiencing exile and of listening to the world in the course of that. And I can say just a thought.
I think you should. I mean, we in preparation again. We prepared without preparing, because you can't really prepare for a conversation, right? So I believe you can only do it to a certain point. One of the ways in which we thought we would organize our conversation is around these three figures that George has concentrated so much energy and insight into, namely Zweig, namely Sholem, namely Benjamin, and Arendt will be somewhere possibly in the background. I certainly, if you don't bring her up, I certainly will. So yes, say something about them, and I think you want to say something about them in the context of what they listened to, how they listened to, perhaps what they didn't want to hear, different ways of approaching the act of attention.
I mean, I think it's an interesting spectrum because it's impossible to say that one of their ways of listening was wrong, but they're radically distinctive. I mean, there's no question. The easiest byword for Zweig's memoir is nostalgic, right? I mean, The World of Yesterday, he one of the original titles for the book was Europe Was My Life. And so much, I think, of the project of that memoir and of the last years of his exile was of listening for the civilization, the palace of European culture that he had once inhabited and saw crumbling into ruins, ravaged by different forms of depredation, and becoming an increasingly uninhabitable space until it became literally uninhabitable for him. But even near the end, he tried to make that kind of listening to the glories of the civilization that he believed he had once occupied some kind of central position for. He tried to make it instructive for the future. And I came to think of his whole memoir as really a message in the bottle for the future, that although it was too late for him, he didn't have the energy to start life again. He by no means saw things as just done. And there was a speech that you may know that he gave in Paris, May 1940, almost immediately before Paris fell to the Nazis. He gave a talk called the Vienna of Yesterday, which in a way became the seed for his memoir. And the point that he tries to make there is that all of the aspects of Austrian culture which the Germans had made fun of, the overinvestment in the arts, the overemphasis on jouissance, the overindulgence in chat and craftswork were ultimately ways that Vienna was able to reimagine itself after the First World War more rapidly than Germany, or he said at that time, he said any other really European country, rightly or wrongly, that we have a responsibility to cultivate our imaginations for reasons that we can't know from where we sit now. And there was a revelatory moment for him. In the late 30s, he began spending more and more time in Brazil. And in a book he wrote about Brazil called Brazil, Land of the Future.
Yeah.
Exactly. He speaks quite humbly about how when he went there for the first time, he imagined that he would be going to this cultural backwater, a great place for adventurers and people who wanted to look at exotic tidbits, but he didn't imagine anything serious. He came, he said, as a typical European. Not only did he find a highly literate culture with all sorts of extraordinary artistic achievements, but he noticed how people of different skin color were holding hands, were sitting together in the same room. And he has this moment, even if that form of racial tolerance was not, who knew how deep it went, he suddenly says to himself, and this is in 1936, 37, he says, maybe all the standards by which I formerly judged progress were completely mistaken. GDP, maybe proof of progress is not GDP or comfort. Those two he singles out in particular. Shouldn't perhaps...
And comfort was such an important aspect of the world of yesterday. What is the name of that chapter? The Age of Security. The Golden Age of Security.
The Golden Age of Security.
Anyway, sorry.
No, just the last thing. That he says, these people have learned how to get along, regardless of race, religion, ideological preference. They can at least be in a room together. They can at least do that. And that maybe is higher. So the entire standard, the hierarchy of values on which he'd been raised seemed to him mistaken. And what he talks about Vienna possessing is in some way an echo of what he said in Brazil. We don't know what knowledge that we have will be useful in what way after some catastrophe. But he certainly makes the case that the civilization he came from at its peak was nurturing those aspects of the psyche and of the body, really, because it's also erotic, that proved to be very important in Vienna's resurrection. Sholem.
Before you get to Sholem, listening for Zweig then entails what?
So listening for Zweig says it isn't all bad. It isn't all bad to be nostalgic for periods of time that we can remember and feel there was something great that is in danger now, or perhaps already entirely corroded.
The good old days.
Well, Benjamin's remark, quoting Brecht, don't start with the good old things, but the bad new ones. But this is not Zweig's position. He says maybe some of our beliefs about what was before were illusions, but those illusions are preferable to what I see unfolding all around me now. And maybe we need to harbor some of those illusions. He talks about that in the preface of his memoir. It's necessary for us to have the strength of spirit to rebuild a society, to preserve something, some image of beauty that was. So Zweig's listening, I think, is saying, let yourself miss things and then conjure what it is that's being missed in a way that another generation may be able to use to begin to germinate a new society.
And I think of that wonderful line of Jonas Salk. He just asks a very simple question. He says, are we good ancestors?
Yeah. It's a great line. There was a story told me that you may have read in this. I mentioned a story that was told me in this book, I Dream with Open Eyes, where I was at a party and there was a drunk older artist speaking to me. And he suddenly began saying, I think the Israelites were lost in the wilderness for 40 years on purpose, that Moses knew what he was doing. He said, Canaan's over there. The promised land's that way. He kept directing them different ways because basically, and this is quite chilling, he felt that this generation didn't have it in them to be able to create the society that he dreamed of in the promised land, and that it was only going to be the children. So he keeps the adults lost in the wilderness for 40 years because, in fact, that was being a good ancestor, was not even trying. And maybe there are some young people who feel this way today.
Sholem.
So Gershom Sholem, who was Benjamin's closest friend when they were young, mathematician when he was younger, in Berlin, he left for then Palestine in 1923. And he already felt that the European project, at least for Jews, was finished. And it came from a deep distrust of the idea of universality. There's a famous moment in his memoir when he talks about, he used to be an anarchist when he was younger, and he remained a religious anarchist. But he talks about his going to political meetings with his brother, who became, in fact, Werner Sholem, I think the youngest member of the KDP ever in the Bundestag. But he goes to a meeting where his brother is speaking, and the guy next to him says, the Jew gives a pretty good talk, pretty good for the Jew. And he realizes at that moment that the whole idea that we're all one together is a myth, and that we have to listen to essentially to our family, to some kind of, to our people. He definitely believes in the idea of the Jewish people as it's not essentialist. He talks about the Jew as whatever a Jew thinks a Jew wants to be. It doesn't have to, it's not a blood clan, but it's a clan of identity. And he basically came to feel that the entire vector of European progressive culture that thought we could all be one equal happy family was just not, it just was impossible. He might not have judged it in quite that way if he had ever had a positive experience of it, but growing up in essentially a middle class, slightly upper middle class Jewish enclave in Berlin, not nearly as wealthy as Benjamin, but perfectly well-to-do, and seeing how his family was completely self-segregated, but talked all the time of themselves as high German, proud German, he just thought these people are delusional. So another form of listening is to try to understand really some kind of identity in our ancestral memory, to come back to that idea. Who were our good ancestors? And do we have a bond to them that we can find ways of expressing that remove us from the illusory world, the kind of essentially mob world of a society without any pretense of an identity to which we commit ourselves. Not an identity, it has to be that we, when Sholem was growing up in a completely assimilated family, it wasn't that he was going back to his roots in any kind of concrete way. And critically also, I think it's worth saying in the context of this historical moment, he was an intense Zionist, but his Zionism really, for a long time at least, was cultural Zionism.
Right. Yeah.
He wasn't going to Palestine in 1923 to create a Jewish homeland. And he always said, basically, there isn't space here. It's not going to work. It's not going to work because there's another population. It's not going to work because this piece of land can't support this many people. But he had this image that if the Jews, or rather a kind of intellectual cultural elite of the Jews, went and worked and had some kind of settlement in Palestine, that this could become a catalyst to the rejuvenation, reinvigoration, renewal of the global diaspora. And, it was the extremely grave situation of East European Jews first, and then obviously the Holocaust that made that position much more vexed for him. I mean, he was one of a small number of Hebrew University professors who, in the immediate aftermath of the Six-Day War, said that the territory should be returned immediately to the Palestinians, that it was wrong to think that you could colonize these. Anyway, so that form of listening, I guess, is ancestral listening, and thinking
ancestral.
Yeah. And then Benjamin, I think, says we're already all in exile. We are estranged. In a way, I find him maybe the most pertinent to at least how I'm feeling at this moment. That
most pertinent, not permanent, most pertinent in what regard?
In the sense that he didn't have any fantasies about a past as having been perfect and then falling apart, in the sense that maybe we can gain something from our estrangement. Maybe it gives us a freshness of attention. He writes about this idea a lot, that there's something about the dislocated glance, the displaced ear, that can enable a form of exciting wonder in relationship to experience. And he also saw his role as very much a detective. I mean, you probably
as a detective. Yeah,
he
sure.
read Simenon all the time.
Yeah.
He read detective. He tried to write a detective novel. He did write a detective play. And I really, one thing when I'd written about him in relationship to Sholem that I didn't see so much was how much he was indebted to Freud. And it's acknowledged in different places, but not very much.
Before you even get to talk more about Benjamin, you're really magnificent. George wrote a book about his leave-taking from his homeland, terms he wouldn't like, and which probably are not at all correct. But when he left the United States to go to London, he wrote, I don't know exactly what to call it, but it's a long meditation really on leave-taking in part. And it's called I Dream with Open Eyes, a memoir about reimagining home. I encourage all of you to read it tonight. And he has this passage which I just want to read to you. The limitation or lag in our capacity to appraise what we see need not be taken as a strictly negative phenomenon. However, we know so much about the world today that conduces to a petrifying despondency, political, cultural, and planetary. Sites of the unknown might be approached as a forensic challenge for those of us in quest of fresh prospects, not simply the ratification of facile denunciations and blind fear. In times of terror, when everyone is something of a conspirator, everybody will be in a situation where he has to play detective, Walter Benjamin once wrote. If we pause long enough to bring the requisite layers of context to what we're looking at now, we may discover clues that can help us begin tracing where to turn next in our search for answers. And then this paragraph, I think, is fantastic. Recalling her experience of analysis with Freud, the poet H.D. remarked that it wasn't the case that Freud summoned the past and invoked the future. It was a present that was in the past or a past that was in the future. The notion evokes the quasi-Kabbalistic approach to historical materialism espoused by Benjamin, who wrote of the imperative to blast open the continuum of history. Thinking comprises not only the flow of thoughts, but their arrest as well, he proposed, calling for a new type of historian who would cease telling the sequence of events like the beads of a rosary. Instead, he challenged historians to grasp the constellation that their own era formed with an earlier one. In this way, that we might be able to establish a conception of the present as a time of the now, which is shot through with chips of messianic time. I feel that that works perfectly with what you were saying. It says, and also, that, of course, even the word detective comes up.
Well, I mean, two things that occur to me. Yeah. I mean, first of all, that those chips of messianic time, I can't emphasize too strongly enough that although Walter Benjamin is often pictured as one of the classic Central European melancholics, I think that's overplayed. He was also a person of whom one lover said, when Benjamin laughed, the whole world opened up. And I think he delighted in the world all the time, and that coexisted with, it's not that melancholy is wrong, but it's overemphasized because he didn't have hope. I mean, that's the wrong word. But he didn't foreclose on the possibility of a radical transformation that would, in a I think, a miraculous fashion that was yet a miraculous form that drew on the historical substrate of our day-to-day experience, would be effectively a profane messianic arrival and interruption of the catastrophic morass in which we currently are sinking and subsiding further and further. And
you're talking about this moment.
I'm talking about this moment in that sense. But, you know, he wouldn't ever, he wouldn't ever separate the moments, right? He puts them together. And that's another way in which I think Freud was really relevant, because, you know, Freud isn't trying to get the whole process exactly of every single phase, the flow of evolution. He's looking, at least in certain iterations, for these core traumatic moments that sort of set the psyche of the contemporary individual awry and deflate their capacity to be in the world in any kind of salubrious fashion. And I think that the way that Benjamin looks at the historical unconscious of our society is identical to the kind of forensic probing that Freud was doing with the individual personality. And, you know, I don't know that he read Civilization and Its Discontents, which was written towards the end of 1929 and then rewritten slightly in 1930, 31. But he certainly read Beyond the Pleasure Principle. And that was very important to his thinking about Proust and a number of other works as well. And that idea that we are living in this struggle between aspects of ourselves that our culture can nurture the bad or the good, to put it in a more binary fashion. You know, if we all possess this sort of capacity to be the murderer and the detective, we can live in societies that coarsen us, or societies that make us more sensitive to the real richness of what human achievement can be, which certainly Benjamin was also attuned to. I mean, I was speaking to Paul earlier about this example of that I think of as Twitter, where I didn't go off Twitter, but I stopped using it, and I stopped even clicking on things. And I wanted to just see what happened to my feed over time, what the algorithm did based on whatever it had before. And
how it was listening to you now that you were not talking.
Yeah, and now that I was not there.
Right.
I'd managed to vanish into the collection.
You vanished, yeah. You decided to do something better with your time, and what was happening during that time? I think
it's really important for people to recognize this, because it is going into the heads of millions of people. My feed is now almost entirely, there are a few journalists who stayed on and who I still follow, and other than that, it is basically people hurting each other as humor. I don't know how many of you might have had this experience, but fights in parking lots, fights in restaurants, couples fighting, all this sort of reality, things captured on surveillance TV, grotesque behavior, all presented as with exclamation point, wow, or she got hers, or he got his, humor, these bot
emojis,
these bot am I still on?
Yeah.
These bot-generated scenes of violence that are being ingrained in the public who is immersed in that media as entertainment, and it's mixed with sort of light eroticism. So there's 5 violent little snippets, and then somebody sort of bouncing in space, and that combination, which is also an eroticizing of violence, which is a libidinal form of murderousness. I am 100% sure that is the experience that many people are getting for God knows how long at a time. And how can this not be desensitizing, debasing, preparing people for forms of non-virtual violence? It is a gladiatorial form of frisson and voyeurism that is so ugly.
So it does bring to mind something that we spoke about, which I think in a way is interesting at the end of a few days of contemplating what listening might mean. It might entail, and in my view, how utterly important it is, of course, which is not listening and what not to listen to,
right?
And what to listen. As Lena said in her introduction, what to listen to, what to listen for. What in some way to close yourself from. I mean, in
right.
your case, you closed yourself from that online platform for a reason.
Right. Well, in that context, I thought of this set of remarks that Jung made when he encountered Hitler in the flesh.
You have that.
I do have this quote, if I can just...
You have that, and then you have the extraordinary moment of Klaus Mann, which you might want to read just because it fits so perfectly with some of our world leaders.
Yes. If you'll give me half a second, I'll find this. Yes. Okay, so Jung says, and this is a quote, that he was like an automaton with a mask, like a robot or a mask of a robot. He never laughed, he only sulked. Quote, he seemed as if he might be a double of a real person, and that Hitler the man might perhaps be hiding inside like an appendix, and deliberately so hiding in order not to disturb the mechanism. He says that's not very surprising, because what that robot was, which works with Benjamin's automaton of history as well, is really the unconscious of 78 million Germans. That's Jung's words. This was what made him so powerful. He was like a man, quote, who listens intently to a stream of suggestions in a whispered voice from a mysterious source, and then acts upon them.
So that's really interesting, right?
So that's a form of listening.
It's a form of listening to the mob.
Which I think is absolutely something that some of our leaders are practicing now. I mean, when Trump describes the way he speaks of the weave. I always think of his hair, which is always also described as a very complex weave. But he, and we could go into a little bit into the Hannah Arendt thing here, but I don't think that his incoherence is accidental. I think it's a weird form of listening for sort of the worst sewer streams of our culture, and then managing to find a way through that gurgling bile to say the words that are maximally reflective of the maximally worst sides of our culture.
And fairly the discombobulated nature of the speech pattern, so that you, in the end, it's not like what we were speaking about yesterday, which is a great conversation, is a conversation where you don't know what happened.
Right.
Which I truly believe. You sort of have an impression, but you can't recall all of it. Here, it's just utter confusion, and it's creating.
But it is a form of listening, and it's obviously the wrong form. He
yes.
is listening, and he's
listening
listening well, or he wouldn't have managed to stay in power as long as he has. So it's a form of listening that I think we are all being tempted by now, because there are so many of these churning dark forces, and there is something kind of satanically, titanically charismatic about the darkness. I mean, and this is something also, of course, that Benjamin saw frequently and was himself sometimes in an ambivalent position in relationship to. In the Paris that he spent time in the late 20s and the early 30s, he was with people who would later have take on Nazi collaborationist positions. So there, you can't simply deny that there is a magnetism, but maybe there's a responsibility that we are in desperate need of now to also listen to the best of our culture. It's not that we can shut all that out completely, but we also have to bear in mind these voices, these sounds that preserve us from despondency and compliance and a kind of slow motion zombification of the soul that leaves us in an abyss from which there is no emerging, because there are no sides. Or something.
I'm feeling more and more depressed, aren't you? I mean, but still there is that.
There is that potential.
There is a potential
to listen to the right things.
If you listening to the right things, it's interesting because you said maybe we can speak about. This might be the moment to bring up Arendt, and it is, in my view. You have this really interesting piece, I think, in the LA Review of Books. It was published in the first Trump moment, and unfortunately things haven't improved, but gotten just quite a bit worse. And so this is interesting also for Samantha. I think it's interesting because we spoke about language and home and those kinds of thoughts, and bringing in Celan and a lot of other writers to bear on this question of language being what remains and the home it might provide. There you have the fight. One could call it really more than a quarrel, the falling out of grace for each other of Arendt and Sholem. And you write about language in a different way here, and also the fact that the clownish aspect sometimes can be a danger. It can be dangerous to gloss over it in that way. And you write, what Arendt failed to register in Jerusalem, this is when she wrote her book, was a stumbling, jargony, nonsensical joke of Eichmann's speech, was intensely effective at maximizing his wiggle room before the law. By being as unclear as possible, that's what I think is so interesting. Eichmann cast not just his own testimony, but the facts themselves into a soupy haze of ambiguity. Moreover, it's plain that by doggedly mangling the language, Eichmann struck the Achilles heel of high intellectuals like Arendt, triggering an urge to snicker even when the subject under discussion was the near annihilation of European Jewry. A buffoon who doesn't even have the mental wherewithal to defend himself except in comically inarticulate banalities is not someone an intelligent person with a liberal bias readily sends off to the gallows. What Arendt missed, and maybe didn't hear properly, we might talk about her own contained reactions at the trial. What Arendt missed above all was a possibility that mediocrity could be performed, and that the man under trial for his life might be a versatile shapeshifter, constantly adjusting his clown act to make his character appear not innocent of the acts he was accused of, but potentially exculpable by virtue of inanity. It's hard not to read that passage without thinking of the present.
Well, there's so much commentary on his speech, on the current president's speech, and it is hard not to laugh. But, the subject of humor has come up frequently since I've been here, in both our private conversations with Samantha and with Josh, and also on stage. And, it's both been a way of defending our sense of sanity to laugh, but there is a risk that I wrote in this book at one point that Trump may, when I was leaving and people were saying, why would you let this junk con artist dictate a move like this, a maximum move? He's a joke. He's a joke. I found myself thinking, it's true. He's a bad joke, but he's an infinitely bad joke.
And we did talk also about jokes, so we're coming back to that. Yes, anyway.
Yeah, and that idea that our own sense of intellectual superiority to inarticulate vomitings of speech in which everything can be read and nothing can be read.
Everything can be read, but very little can be understood.
And very little can be done with what we understand. It's definitely, the fact that Trump would use, in these words, call his speech something that he believes in is masterful as a weave. I'm not saying he's not diminished cognitively to some extent. I'm sure that he is. But I'm also sure that he's seen it work again and again and again and again. A kind of speech that I imagine is not so different than what Eichmann did. And, just in terms of language, the fact that his name keeps coming up, rereading the beginning of this book, which I wrote it in 2018 or something. I had been maybe in 2017, or then I was at a dinner at which there was a very eminent sociologist. And that person suddenly said, as the subject of Trump came up, I think that Trump is being spoken about right now more than any person in history. And everyone in the room kind of went, my God, we've just contributed to that phenomenon. But it is somehow irresistible. And there are those journalists who refuse to say his name, but it strikes me as battling with the wind. What does it even mean to think that we can just omit it that way? That word clearly captures something of who we are.
So interesting, because I was in Tasmania some years ago at a literary festival in Melbourne and then Sydney, and I asked if I could spend a couple of days in Tasmania, and there's a museum there, the Museum of the Old and the New, that was founded by a man who made $5 billion by gambling and gave back that money to Tasmania in the form of this museum. And there's a waterfall when you come in, and in the waterfall you see what are the most searches of Google. And the whole waterfall for about 10 seconds was Trump, 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 Trump. Anyway, that just comes in it didn't stay that way. Then it replaced something else. Maybe the second search then was Google, 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 Google. I don't know. I can't remember what it was, but it was astounding.
So it is in some way mirroring. It is in some way that word, which of course is a made-up word. A made-up name. The Trump, the best, and clearly for some of us, the worst. And there's a Orwellian inversion in the very idea of coming up trumps. This idea of in cards, in the Trump suit is the top suit, and it's the apex. It's, again, to use that word from Benjamin, the apogee. But the ways in which he distorts language themselves, I think, are also popular. And that gets to the Klaus Mann that you were mentioning, where There's this amazing passage in Klaus Mann's memoir where he talks about being in, if I remember correctly, in Munich in the Carlton, the tea room, and he sees Hitler and a party of his cronies around a table. And there's Hitler stuffing his face with strawberry tartlets, pudgy and a vulgarian. And he says how he realizes at this moment, and this is 1932, I think, that it is impossible that this man will ever be the leader of Germany. He's a petit bourgeois. He's a joke. And then, shall I read his exact words?
Do.
It's just a few lines. He says that he later acknowledges his mistake, which wasn't that he'd underrated Hitler, but that he'd overrated his countrymen. They were smitten with his grammatical howlers and brassy lies, his slimy humor, his illiteracy, his bullying, his whining, his nervous fits, his half-crazed megalomania, everything that made him revolting to me, beguiled and inspired them. I mean,
Sure.
There's a lot there about the idea of a mob form of listening. You know, what are the forms of listening that allow us to distinguish whatever we can individually contribute to the world in ways that we can then manifest them ourselves? And what are forms of listening that make us blur into a much more, the word isn't animal, it's not right, but a much more primal horde that is not capable of judgment. And maybe that gets also a little bit towards that idea of what Sholem was suspicious in the universal. I think he was suspicious of the mob in the same ways that Freud was. And, you know, Benjamin had this quixotic and quite beautiful faith in, I don't even think it's a faith in the people, but a faith in the sense of responsibility. You know, he knew in some way that his whole project was doomed, but there were people who were hungry.
Well, speak a little bit about this notion of failure,
Right.
which is what you're working on in some way now.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to write something really calling him the Messiah of failure, because his own life clearly didn't work out in many objective ways, but also because I think he saw a message of deliverance in the acceptance of a certain kind of failure. You know, there's a famous passage when he's writing about Kafka, right, where he says, I mean, basically, once he realized that he was a failure, everything worked out like a dream. And in a way, I see that kind of idea of failure as a counterpoint to this brutal emphasis on success and power and coming first, that endless obsession with winning. You know, Benjamin takes an antithetical, a completely antipodal position on what our responsibility is. And people spoke often of his incredible patience, of a certain kind of serenity. Unlike Zweig, who was nervous and very upset. And Sholem clearly made the right choice for life. He's the one of the three that doesn't kill himself. How can you argue otherwise? But it was in a very directed, very, very focused way. And Benjamin suggests that maybe we can fail and find in failure an opening in ourselves that allows for, again, some profound and even redemptive transformation of not just our condition, but of all the people who are even far worse off than we can really imagine.
So, George, I mean, early on, as Lena was mentioning, you wrote this book, which I also encourage everybody to read, In Pursuit of Silence, Listening for Meaning in a World of Noise. And in a sense, the work you're doing now is, you're still interested by these very ideas. They've, you know, I often like to say that one sort of creates an organized web of obsession right? They are speaking about weaving. They come back again and again to haunt you, like the ghosts you can't quite move away from, or the quotation I had yesterday of Milosh, the doors are open. So I'm curious now, given the predicament of our present, which doesn't seem so far removed from the predicament of other presents, what are we to do in this world that seems so utterly cacophonic? I mean, how do we listen there? How do we actually listen for the signs?
Well, one thing that happened there, in this book, it's the closest to a journalistic book that I've written, where I travel around to different environments that are noisy and not so noisy, and meet different people.
Why they are noisy and why they are not noisy.
And thought a lot about the definition of noise, because it's something that's very vexed philosophically for those of you who've read in this area. It's something very hard to get any clear sense of objective sense. Famously, my dog makes a very gentle sound each night. Your dog makes noise. What I listen to is music. What you listen to is noise.
And I never can hear ambulances in the same way after reading you. Because we were just hearing ambulances. You have this one.
I spoke to a neuroscientist who said, that even though we obviously inure ourselves to the sense that that sound is relevant, we block it out. She said that physiologically, neurologically, we can't do that. And then, in fact, we always think the siren is coming for us. And so we are always being agitated. I mean, some of the most interesting work on noise was done in Germany maybe a decade ago or something, where I can't remember the name of the researcher, but it was someone working with people who lived in the periphery of an airport, not right up against it, but relatively close. And this individual was looking at sleeping subjects in relationship to noise. So people who, they blocked it out, it's fine. And the shocking discovery of this research was that all of the stress markers physiologically elevated every time the plane went off. Blood pressure, heartbeat, pulse, all of the release of adrenaline, all of these stress markers were absolutely being experienced by these people who were sleeping. So I'm very suspicious of the people who speak with pride, often a kind of macho pride, of their ability to get used to noise. It's not what we're made for. I mean, our hearing, as I talk about in this book, is largely an amplification system. I mean, we make a sound something like, if I remember correctly, 100 times as loud. I mean, we can hear, if we were all just to stop for a second, we can hear a pin drop. And you have to think about the energy being released by that pin, just how small it is. But one definition of noise, what differentiates it from sound as such, is that it's sound out of place, sounding out of place. And I rather like that. But I can't.
A bit like Freud talking about that dirt is matter out of place.
Yeah. But I came to think maybe that the issue, the way we should think about it, is like a dietary pyramid, where in the same way that a nutritionist might say we can have salt and sugar and fatty foods, but they should be at this tiny little bit of the pyramid, and we have these different nurturing sounds as the pyramid expands towards the base. We live in a world where our sound diet is largely fat, salt, and sugar. It's pumped up, it's absolutely stimulating, and it's too much. And for sure it has a political resonance because it is distracting and agitating. And so we're not listening properly. So if we think about noise in relationship to, if we think about silence in relationship to being in a space where we can hear the most.
And be there.
And be there, exactly. And think of noise as sound that makes us incapable of absorbing more than that particular sound, that it blocks out everything else, that it's an overwhelming stimulus. I mean, one of the most amazing, another piece of research that I found so interesting, because I think a lot about why, at least in New York and London, virtually every cafe, every restaurant is playing music, right? I mean, it's a bass line, and there are people working, but there's music. Or at our hotel, there's music during breakfast. There's music,
Right.
music. And nobody has, to the best of my knowledge, done the next stage. But there were two studies that I kind of tried to bring together about dopamine. And people with what used to be called autism spectrum disease, there has been research looking at how a bass band of noise actually can help people study or focus. And the reason has been at least put forward that this is because in people with at least certain stages of autism that there's a insufficient amount of dopamine, and the stimulation of the music creates the dopamine that allows the brain to function properly. But now I think so many of us have blown out through overstimulation our dopamine receptors when we're relatively young. I mean, young people, that there is just a vast swath of society that needs that band of constant stimulation in order to be able to think at all. But what thoughts are had in the same way we're talking about what to listen to? What thoughts are had when that smear of sound is the necessary predicate of listening at all? I had this beautiful moment near the end of what I write about, where I went to the laboratory of Natalie, a cellular biologist at that time, and I didn't know what I was looking for, but I wanted to be with scientists, and she had said you should come. And it was a relatively big lab. And quite spontaneously, all of these different scientists began presenting me with their favorite sounds. The way a little burner torch worked when they were putting together a slide, the sound of certain sorts of cogs being turned. Everyone had there was a delicate symphony. It was very, very quiet in the lab. But there was also an unbelievably fertile and beautifully varied, heterogeneous kaleidoscope of sound.
So what does that experience, if you can enlarge that experience of that moment to what a better possible form of listening might be?
Well, at least I really are.
Also in the political sphere.
I mean, I really argue, and I think I would still repeat, although this book was written a long time ago, that we have to vary that diet. And, if you're in some place like Heidelberg, you have to hike up fairly far before you don't hear the road, but you can hike there. You can do it without too much trouble. And I think we really have to make a conscious effort to mix the sound the sonic ingestion, whether it's social media, let alone just the kind of fighting that we see in the news. We have to vary that in ways that allows for thought, that pause in which real imagination and real intellectual work and real problem solving, reflection can take place. A lot of these thinkers that we've been talking about felt that something had been lost in the headlong rush into modernity. We'd missed something. We'd missed clues. I think everyone we've spoken about tonight have felt that. And so while the answer is not to say where we are now means in 5 years we're not going to have any democracy and we're all going to be slaves of this, that's a dead end. And certainly something Benjamin argued against over and over. Because he didn't believe that we could be prognosticate about the future. Right. There's an arrogance to that. It's an empty, and I think we live in a moment where there is so much kind of Nicodemus-like flammery, where there are people projecting either images of the apocalypse or images of dystopia, and they're equally unhelpful. He felt we have to listen to tradition much harder, and he speaks
more about that, because
again, quoting Kafka.
No, that is
talking about Kafka.
Yeah.
He who listens hard does not see. He says that listens hard does not see. And in a way, I think about this also in relationship to Benjamin's myopia, where he literally couldn't see unless it was right up before him very well at all. But he was unbelievably sensitive to sound and was troubled by noise in different environments. Although he wrote about it a bit as well. But I think that we're not going to solve the problem that we're in so deep that we're not going to get there by just sort of envisioning a better future, whatever that means. We have to have a form of dynamic listening to the past, not a kind of, neither just a straight nostalgia, nor some sort of self-flagellation. It's not interesting. But we have to find these moments, these characters, some of them with beauty, not all trauma, that we can somehow bring into our world now and vanish into in ways that hopefully allow for a better world to kind of effloresce and blossom in the space that we have made in ourselves by being so attentive. You know, when Benjamin is attentive to decay and ruin and detritus, when he compares the poet to the ragpicker, when he thinks about what it means to look in the margins and in the spaces that are overlooked, he's not just looking for clues to go back to the detective to a murder. He's also looking at the kind of wondrous new growths that happen in these spaces of ruins and of destruction. It's not just a melancholy gaze.
No, and there's beauty in the detritus as well.
There's beauty, and there's something like, if not hope, again, a reminder of time's complexity, its convolutions, right? He was very interested in the idea of these correspondences, not in any sort of flow of time, but in moments that could be brought into a montage where you have some kind of dialectical explosion, and it's never very clear what he means there, I feel, or it isn't clear enough, or it doesn't exactly work for me. But what works is the idea that we have if what we know now is not very good. It doesn't look very good to the extent that we can see, but we can't see through darkness. And if we're seeing darkness, that's opaque. And we have to preserve a kind of healthy relationship to the unknown and listening for we know not what, because we know not how to emerge from this moment into some more salubrious and hopefully for our children or for the children that we care about who aren't our own biologically, and for all of the people who are suffering so terribly. Sorry. We want to hold on to something other than just sorrow at how much has been lost.
You know, he says in The Storyteller, he has that one line that I always think about, that there's a beauty in what is vanishing.
He's very interested in transience as a space of hope.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you all very much. Thank you for listening. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.